Why do we think dragons breathed fire? Where did that idea come from? You see, if you know the history of dragons with their earliest myths rooted in the watery origins, then fire breathing seems out of place with how ancient cultures perceive them. This video will explain why that is. So grab a cup of tea as we go dragon hunting, and welcome to Crecganford. I'd like to start with a quick introduction to dragon myths, their age, their origins, and their somewhat surprising evolution. I have explained this evolution in depth in a previous video, in case you want to understand how I know what I'm about to say, but here's a synopsis for those who need a refresher. Now, the oldest dragon myths can be traced back to southern Africa, where a rain snake carved the landscape at the beginning of time and brought water to the land, a myth which we have confidence in being over 70,000 years old and which has spread across the world, perhaps with the rainbow serpent of Australia being one of the best known examples of this. And it was these serpents that would influence the myths and evolve into the dragons we know today. And we can see a dispersal of the myth using the mythology database showing this worldwide distribution. Now, we then see dragon myths in Asia and stories still told today in China that show dragons as being benevolent to the people, but malevolent to those who held power, eventually being trapped under the mountains and becoming the source of major rivers. These Chinese dragons were, and are still serpent-like today, and this connection with water continued, but changed as agricultural societies emerged. Dragons were seen as guardians of water, controlling rains and floods. But when there was no rain, the dragons were blamed, and so the gods were created to battle these dragons on mountain tops and in the sky, and when these monsters were defeated, water was released, and this saw the rise of the storm gods in agricultural communities as farming spread from the Near East and off through Anatolia and India. But farming changed on the steppes around the Black Sea and was more pastoral focused, the bovine becoming the important animal in society, and so the myth changed and the dragon was said to steal cattle. And so wherever tribes saw cattle being owned by the enemies, they considered them stolen by the dragon, and so cattle raiding myths began and they spread wherever Indo-European cultures influenced. This slide shows where we see the key traditions that support that myth today. But then, through what could be considered a strange twist of fate and a very large dose of misinterpretation, the story of the cattle-stealing dragon became the story of the princess kidnapping dragon. And this dragon evolved the ability to breathe fire. And whilst the mythology database doesn't have a dragon kidnapping princess motif, it does have Dragon Winner, which covers this myth and more, and this has a very interesting dispersal which we will come to later. And so with this is, well, where we see dragons introduced, and these dragons are the ones we are now more familiar with in today's folklore. But whilst the evolution of dragon myth is fascinating, even here dragons and serpents didn't breathe fire. It was not part of their attributes. So where did this fire-breathing monster evolution begin? Well, before fire-breathing dragons became a part of our myths, it probably won't be much of a surprise to know that other creatures were said to breathe fire, the most famous of which is the Chimera from Greco-Roman mythology. Now, what makes the Chimera so fascinating is that some scholars suggest it could be an early prototype for the dragon, and like dragons in early myths, the Chimera was a composite of different creatures, an amalgamation of traits from the animal kingdom, and were in a way reminiscent of modern Chinese dragons, which in their earliest depictions included human faces, bird feathers and a serpent-like form. The Chimera itself was an odd hybrid with a lion's head, a goat's body and a serpent's tail, and this combination made it sort of terrifying as it symbolised chaos and danger and unpredictable forces of nature, themes that ran deep in myth. But where did this beast come from? So when did we see the first Chimera in myth, and it is in Homer's Iliad, written in the 8th century BCE, where Homer describes it as a terror that plagued the land of Lycia, breathing fire and embodying destruction. But was this the Chimera's true beginning? You see, there's evidence to suggest that its roots might stretch back further in time, to earlier traditions like those of ancient Egypt. Figures such as the Sphinx with its lion's body and human's head, or deities like Anubis and Taurit, show a fascination with hybrid creatures. This suggests a cultural exchange of mythological motifs between Egypt and Greece, perhaps carried through trade routes or through shared religious practices, but certainly as part of Egypt's influence on Greece. The Greek myths may have borrowed some of Egypt's influence, and in which case we can say that the Chimera travelled from Egypt to Greece, transforming as it passed through cultures and lands, influenced by landscape and society, as many myths are. But the Chimera was not the only fire-breathing monster in mythology. Across the world we see glimpses of this attribute. In West African folklore, the Ninki Nanka is a fearsome winged monster said to have the body of a crocodile or snake and spits fire. And we also find in Tonga the Naimi, a legendary water dragon, which is believed to breathe fire and emit smoke from its nostrils, and embodies the sort of nurturing and destructive powers of the Zambezi River. But folklore isn't myth, and the age of these stories, and in fact most of the stories from Africa, is really unknown. Then, if we cross the ocean to South America, the Koivilu is a huge serpent from Mapuche mythology, the ruler of water, and who is said to have fiery breath and smoking nostrils. In Europe, we see in Scandinavian mythology the Storjordet, a mysterious sea dragon said to dwell in Lake Storjen, and is described as a fire-breathing beast, a beast which is not too dissimilar to the infamous Loch Ness monster from Scotland, although there's no stories of that breathing fire at all. And in China we have the Kiao, which is a mighty sea serpent with a fiery nature and bringer of both fortune and destruction. And finally, if we head to the Near East, we see in Arabian mythology there is Al-Tinin, a dragon-like sea monster who has fiery breath and smoke-filled nostrils, whose twin tails give off a sense of malevolence which makes this creature seem, well, rather evil. But with these stories, these monsters, their origins are hard to tell, and none of them really represent the fire-breathing dragon we're familiar with today. Most would, well, be considered more of a product of local folklore as opposed to sacred myth. But there were dragons that breathed something else. Dragons who almost breathed fire. These dragons hold a clue on how fire-breathing dragons developed. And if we start with the mythical and well-known ancient Mesopotamian serpents of the Babylonian myth of creation, Tiamat and Apsu, then we see these serpents are still water-focused creatures, but are often considered dragons, although they did not breathe fire. But besides them, geographically at least, we do have the Mesopotamian dragon Medusa, which is associated with Marduk, and this was seen as being venomous, which, whilst not fire-breathing, is an attribute we should take very careful note of. Now, in India, the Vedic traditions, we see the serpent Vrutra as holding water, and Vrutra has much in common with Tiamat, and like Tiamat, does not breathe fire. And I'll talk about Vrutra and Tiamat's commonality in this video if you want to learn more. But these two beasts seem to have too much in common to be coincidence. But the dragons, or at least dragon-type monsters, get more interesting as we head back to the ancient Greece, home of the Chimera, as here we do see multi-headed dragons like the Hydra of Lerna, which continues to be associated with water, but which also spat venom, much like the Mesopotamian dragon. However, Ovid wrote in Metamorphoses about the fight between Cadmus and the dragon. With its fangs and its constricting coils and tainted, poisonous breath, it slew them all. Now the blood began to flow from its poison-laden throat. And this spitting of poison and blood from the mouth would burn the victim, much like how fire would burn. But then we read in Apollodorus in Library Book 163 about Typhon, the water dragon. Such and so great was Typhon when, hurling kindled rocks, he made for the very heaven with hissing and shouts, spouting a great jet of fire from his mouth. And here Apollodorus, who lived probably around 100 to 200 years after Ovid, and so early first millennium, has created and transformed the dragonesque monster from a poison spitter to a fire breather. Although there will be some people who point out that monsters like Typhon aren't dragons, as we would recognise them in their typical physical form. But to focus on that would sort of miss the transformational point of what's going on in the story. It is poison. We see many dragons spit poison before becoming fire-breathing, and then we start to see a change to fire-breathing animals. And why is this? Well, let me show you. This is a poison-breathing dragon. And this is a fire-breathing dragon. When oral tradition changes into writing and art, you need something more visually expressive. And whilst people can imagine the pain of poisoning, visually it does not compare with a fire-breathing dragon, which will too give you the pain of poisoning, that burning sensation. But there may be other influences as well alongside this. I often talk about myths evolving to reflect the landscape and society. And so another view of the dragon breathing fire was with myths in lands with volcanoes. We do have evidence that the volcanic eruptions, incredibly powerful events, could have played a part in the association of fire with dragons, with the eruptions being said to be caused by dragons. And this could make sense if the dragon was being associated also with thunderstorms at the time, because the tangible observations of loud booms of thunder, often considered the dragon breathing, roaring, was already associated with the creature. So loud volcanic eruptions could equally be applied to dragons, along with the spectacle of fire and lava flying through the air. Between the many-headed Typhon, spitting poison and exploding volcanoes, coupled with the increased importance of writing and art, we then get to what is commonly considered the first appearance of a fire-breathing, European dragon in its typical form, and this is in the Anglo-Saxon epic Beowulf. The Beowulf dragon is the earliest example in literature of the typical European dragon, and the first instance of a fire-breathing dragon, as opposed to a monster or serpent, a more ambiguous form. The Beowulf dragon is described within the text using Old English terms such as draka, meaning dragon, but we also see worm, meaning reptile or serpent, but we also see that this dragon also has a venomous bite, something that many fire-breathing dragons probably haven't lost, but the fire-breathing part of them is now considered more important. So take note for those who write about such things. A small dragon with no or little flame can still bite you and cause a painful, burning, poisonous death. But there is more to that dragon than that, for we see other traits develop in Beowulf, traits that we now think of as common, including dragons being nocturnal, treasure hunting, inquisitive and vengeful. Whilst I think there is good reason to assume poison became or at least led to the introduction of fire breathing, there were other pressures placed on the development of the dragon. Some believe the Beowulf dragon is inspired from the Bible, and one of the dragons in there, Leviathan. We see this monster possibly considered a symbol of the devil within a biblical context, best described within the book of Job, although Job was probably written before the devil appeared in the Bible, but it certainly may have taken on an evil form. And so the Bible, at the time of writing Beowulf, was available to the author of Beowulf, and so perhaps the monster in there, and there are other dragons and serpents too in the Bible, Perhaps the monster in there influences the monster that Beowulf must contend with, and is a reflection of this great sort of monstrous adversary of God, man and beast alike, and sometimes described as being fiery red in colour. But not far behind this time is the saga of Ragnar, which, like Beowulf, originated in Scandinavia. Here the king of the Swedes brought several snakes while hunting and gave them to his daughter to look after. She fed them every day, giving them a whole cow's head, and then when these snakes matured, they burned everything around them with their poisonous breath. The king promised his daughter to whoever would destroy the snakes, and Ragnar succeeded by wetting his fur clothes so they would freeze, protecting him, and then he allowed him to pierce the snakes with a spear. And I think this piece of storytelling really convinces me about poison turning into fire. The language is just there, but I really also think it was art and the visual aspect of art that established it as normal. Before I finish, I want to thank my patrons for their continued support and great questions, one of which led to this video. And their help allows me not only to make videos, but also develop the mythology and folklore database, a source of myth and folklore used by thousands of academics and scholars across the world. So really thank you, and feel free to support me on Patreon if you wish to be part of that. Now, whilst we see poison used commonly for over 1,000 years, in fact thousands of years, to represent burning breath, it is really only in the last 1,000 years or so do we see the change to fire. The imagery really raises the odds of fighting a dragon in medieval European mythology and folklore, the age of rescuing princesses as part of a chivalric romance. Yes, some consider the dragon as a Christian allegory symbolising sin or destruction or the devil, but to me, it is just an attention-grabbing trait which can be imagined or portrayed in art that played on the burning poison and the leverage to power and evil that fire represented to many people, but particularly to Christians because of their view of hell. And this explains the reasonably concentrated area of stories about fire-breathing dragons being pretty much contained within the borders of Christianity, and certainly seen across the Christian part of Europe and into the European Near East areas. Now, if you want to know more about dragons, then I recommend watching this video, and feel free to ask questions in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer as many as I can. And until my next video, please stay safe and well. And this was Crecganford.